Dante Vasconcelos fixed his gaze on Carolina from across the room. 20 years old, golden skin, a body that exuded youth, and a slightly parted mouth that seemed like an invitation. The tight dress accentuated her curves, and she knew it. When their eyes met, she smiled, lightly biting her lower lip. Dante felt the heat rise through his chest. It was a dangerous game, but he always enjoyed challenges. "How you're staring, Vasconcelos," teased Marcelo, his partner beside him. Dante swirled the whiskey in his glass and brought it to his lips, feeling the bitterness of the drink mix with something far more intoxicating: desire. "She's interesting." "Interesting?" Marcelo laughed. "Your wife is here, remember?" Helena, yes, he remembered. She was on the other side of the room talking with some businessmen's wives. Beautiful, sophisticated, but there was something about her that he no longer felt, a complacency that irritated him. Carolina passed by him, leaving a trail of sweet and citrusy perfume that invaded his senses. The soft touch of her fingers, brushing against his hand, was enough to ignite something within him. He couldn't resist. At the end of the event, while Helena chatted with acquaintances, he found Carolina in the parking lot. The night breeze tossed her loose strands of hair against her face. "Do you have the courage to play this game, Mr. Vasconcelos?" Her voice was pure provocation. He approached, feeling the warmth of her body, even without touching her. "I don't. I usually back down from a challenge." She leaned in, her lips just inches from his. The scent of her young, warm skin intoxicated his senses. "Then meet me tomorrow, without the ring." Dante smiled, excitement pulsing through his veins. He had already made his decision, and Helena never knew what hit her. The sound of Helena's heels echoed through the cold marble of the mansion. Dante watched her perfect silhouette from behind, her long hair tied up in an impeccable bun. She exuded class, confidence, everything a successful man could want. But at that moment, while he slid his fingers across the phone screen reading Carolina's last message, "I'm waiting for you," without the ring, he felt he wanted more. Helena turned around, her brown eyes fixing on him. "You seem distant, Dante. Did something happen?" He moistened his lips, feeling the weight of the lie accumulate on the tip of his tongue. Something had happened. He wanted someone else. He wanted Carolina, just work. She frowned, but didn't insist. She walked up to him, her high heels accentuating the movement of her hips. When she stopped in front of him, she placed a delicate hand on his chest. "We need a night just for us. It's been a while since we—" Her voice trailed off, and her fingers slid slowly down his chest. Dante felt the touch, hot and familiar, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't respond. He just took her hand and gently pushed it away. The disappointment in Helena's eyes was like a stab. "You no longer desire me, do you?" He could lie. He could make something up. But instead he turned, grabbed the car keys and muttered, "We'll talk later," and left. Carolina's penthouse was a world apart from his life with Helena. Low lights, the smell of scented candles mixed with her perfume, sweet and provocative. She opened the door wearing a short silk robe, revealing the curve of her thigh. Underneath, a black lace set hugged her young and vibrant body. Dante needed no further encouragement. She closed the door and, without wasting time, pulled him by the tie, bringing his lips to hers. The kiss was hungry, desperate, her hot mouth sucking on his tongue against tongue, a dance of raw desire. He slid his hands around her narrow waist, pulling her against him, feeling every curve, every soft inch of her skin. Carolina moaned against his lips, lightly biting his lower lip before whispering, "I want you now. No rules." He picked her up and pressed her against the wall, feeling her legs wrapped tightly around his waist. The heat between their bodies increased, their skin burning under their clothes. Dante's fingers traced the outline of her breasts, feeling the softness, the shivers. Caused by each touch, his mouth explored her neck, her collarbone, slowly descending as she writhed in pure pleasure. This was it, what he wanted, what he needed, or so he thought. The warmth of Carolina's body still burned on Dante's skin when he woke up in the rumpled bed of her penthouse. The sheets were crumpled, exuding a mix of sweet perfume and sweat. She slept beside him, the sheet sliding off her shoulder, revealing part of her ample breasts and golden skin marked by his hands. Dante ran his fingers over his jaw, trying to dissipate the guilt that, for the first time, weighed on his chest. Helena. Her image crossed his mind like a treacherous blow, but he pushed the thought aside, focusing on the young, seductive body in front of him. Carolina turned lazily, opening her eyes with a satisfied smile. "Already awake, Mr. Vasconcelos?" Her voice came out husky, laden with mischief. She stretched, like a cat, revealing even more of her soft and seductive skin. Her hair fell over the pillow, tousled, and her lips were still swollen from the intense kisses of the previous night. Dante felt his body respond immediately. Carolina noticed and chuckled softly, sliding her fingers over his chest, moving slowly, downward. "I think we're not done yet," she whispered against his skin, leaving a trail of wet kisses that descended dangerously. He pulled her face up, devouring her lips with a deep and possessive kiss. The heat reignited between them, their bodies intertwining again, skin against skin, desire against guilt. But this time something was different. Even while losing himself in pleasure, a growing unease crept inside him. 2 months later, the mansion that Dante and Helena shared was no longer the same. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. She avoided his touch. He avoided the guilt. When he finally delivered the final blow, it was during a cold and lifeless dinner. "I want a divorce." Helena stopped chewing, the fork trembling slightly between her fingers, her brown eyes fixed on him, searching for something. "You have someone else, don't you?" Dante held his breath for a moment. He could lie. He could soften. The blow. But the gleam of determination and pain in her eyes disarmed him. "Yes." The silence was cutting. Helena dropped the utensils and stood up, the chair creaking on the floor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him one last time, as if trying to memorize the face of the man she once loved. Then, without saying another word, she turned and climbed the stairs. Dante stayed there, watching her shadow disappear. Part of him wanted to call her back, to beg for forgiveness, but he didn't call. And that's how he lost her. The whiskey burned in Dante's throat, but the bitter taste wasn't just from the drink. He stared at the glass wall of his luxury apartment, observing the city lights, as if searching for an answer. 2 years. That was how long it had been since he traded Helena for Carolina. At first, life was a whirlwind of pleasures and lust. Carolina was fire and desire, her young and thirsty body always available to satisfy him. But over time, she began to show her true colors. Her interest wasn't just in him, it was in his money, the status he provided. The arguments started subtly, then became frequent. Carolina demanded, wanting more, never satisfied. The sparkle faded. The charm turned into obligation. Desire turned into routine. And then, one day he arrived home to find the bed empty. Drawers open, closets ransacked. She had left, taking her fortune with her and leaving a short note on the table. "Had enough, good luck with your loneliness." The divorce was public, humiliating. The newspapers turned his story into a spectacle. The man who traded his faithful wife for a greedy young woman, the arrogant architect who fell from his pedestal. His reputation was tarnished. And that's how, that night, Dante found himself, there in the same apartment that had witnessed so many nights of empty pleasure, wondering when everything had gone so wrong. Then, his cell phone vibrated in his hand. "There's an important event for the Vasconcelos Foundation tomorrow. You need to attend," said Marcelo, his partner, without beating around the bush. Dante rolled his eyes. The last place he wanted to be was in a ballroom, surrounded by hypocrites, pretending to care, but he needed to restore his image. "I'll be there." He didn't know that fate was about to laugh in his face. The event hall was packed. Women in elegant dresses, men in well-tailored suits, champagne glasses clinking in forced toasts. Dante greeted acquaintances with a calculated smile, but his mind wandered until he saw her. The impact was immediate. An invisible punch to the stomach. Helena. She was standing with her back to him, talking to a group of entrepreneurs. Her hair, always traditionally tied back, now cascaded in perfect waves over her shoulders. The red dress clung to her body, highlighting every curve hypnotically, but it wasn't just her appearance that had changed. She radiated power, confidence, presence. Then she laughed, a light, natural laugh. And that's when Dante realized she was with another man by her side, Rodrigo Farias, young, rich, successful, and very close to her. Dante tightened his grip on the glass, his jaw muscles tensing. Helena moved forward, and that hit him with a force he never expected. Dante felt his chest tighten, something dense and corrosive spreading through his body. Jealousy. But there she was, laughing next to Rodrigo with a gleam in her eyes he hadn't seen in years. Every detail about her was an affront to his arrogance. The red dress highlighted her curves, the thin straps exposed her shoulders, and the side slit revealed the smooth skin of her thigh. Her lips were painted in a deep shade, oscillating between a seductive smile and an expression of pure disdain when her eyes finally met his. Helena saw him, and she didn't waver. His heart raced. Was this a game? Revenge? Or did she simply no longer care? Dante took a deep breath, forcing a smile. He was a predator, and predators don't back down. He grabbed a champagne flute and walked toward the group. Rodrigo's look on him was analytical, evaluative, and Dante didn't like the feeling of being studied. "Dante Vasconcelos," Rodrigo said first with a firm handshake. "Finally we meet." Dante ignored the veiled provocation, turning his attention to what really mattered. Helena. Her name sounded like both a caress and a challenge. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether it was worth her time. "Dante." Her voice came out soft but without a trace of weakness. "Long time no see." Her smell hit his nostrils like a cruel memory. The same floral perfume, but with something thicker, more striking. A new signature. He smiled, analyzing every detail of her body without haste. "You look different, even more beautiful than I remember." Rodrigo cleared his throat beside them, but Helena merely arched an eyebrow. "Different, yes, but beauty, well, maybe you just never paid attention." Dante clenched his jaw, surprised by the sharp response. He expected resentment, indifference perhaps, but not this. Helena was playing, and worse, she was winning. But he wasn't a man who lost easily. He took a step forward, completely ignoring Rodrigo's presence. His voice lowered to a tone only she would hear. "I could swear I felt you looking at me before I arrived, almost desiring something." Helena leaned slightly toward him, her lips near his ear, and Dante felt electricity pulse between them. The heat of her body, the scent of her skin, the warm breath, everything in him reacted. Then she whispered, "You know what's funniest, Dante? I don't desire absolutely anything that comes from you." She pulled away, her eyes shining with triumph. Dante felt the impact, and in that instant, he knew he needed to get her back. Dante felt the bitter taste of rejection still burning in his mouth, but there was no resignation in his eyes. Helena might pretend all she wanted, but he knew that look. He knew the subtle glint deep in her brown eyes, the tension in her shoulders when he got close. Her body betrayed her, even when her mouth said otherwise, and he loved a challenge. The ambient music changed, an engaging rhythm inviting couples to the dance floor. Helena smiled at Rodrigo, and Dante saw how he held her waist, guiding her to the center of the room, not this. Dante's blood boiled. He didn't know if it was ego, pride, or pure desire, but he couldn't allow that. With a quick sip, he left his champagne flute on a waiter's tray and headed to the dance floor. His eyes were fixed on Helena, on the fluid movements of her body, on how her hips slid in perfect harmony with the music. Rodrigo danced well, but Dante saw what others didn't. She wasn't fully engaged. And then in the natural partner exchange of the dance, Dante stepped in between the couple, cutting Rodrigo off without asking permission. Helena gasped, surprised, when she felt his hands firmly grasp her waist. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger and something deeper. Dante smiled, his fingers pressing lightly on the thin fabric of her dress. The curve of her waist fit perfectly in his hands, as if it belonged there, taking back what has always been mine. She let out a short, mocking laugh, but her body was already betraying her words. The muscles of Dante's abdomen brushed subtly against hers, his woody scent seeping into her breath. "Presumptuous as always," she murmured, feeling his fingers slide softly along her back. Dante spun her with mastery, his warm hand gliding from the base of her spine to the curve of her hip. Helena's skin tingled under his touch. "And you pretend. Very well, but you can't lie to me, Helena." His voice dropped an octave, low, charged with raw intensity. He felt it. She felt it too. She pulled away slightly, her lips parted, her cheeks flushed. But Dante didn't let her go. "Let me go," she demanded, but her voice came out weak. He leaned his mouth close to her ear, his warm breath making her catch her breath. "You can say you feel nothing, but your body just told me a different story." She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the involuntary response of her own body, and he didn't intend to lose. Dante felt the bitter taste of rejection still burning in his mouth, but there was no resignation in his eyes. Helena might pretend all she wanted, but he knew that look. He knew the subtle glint deep in her brown eyes, the tension in her shoulders when he got close. Her body betrayed her, even when her mouth said otherwise, and he loved a challenge. The ambient music changed, an engaging rhythm inviting couples to the dance floor. Helena smiled at Rodrigo, and Dante saw how he held her waist, guiding her to the center of the room. Not this. Dante's blood boiled. He didn't know if it was ego, pride, or pure desire, but he couldn't allow that. With a quick sip, he left his champagne flute on a waiter's tray and headed to the dance floor. His eyes were fixed on Helena, on the fluid movements of her body, on how her hips slid in perfect harmony with the music. Rodrigo danced well, but Dante saw what others didn't. She wasn't fully engaged. And then, in the natural partner exchange of the dance, Dante stepped in between the couple, cutting Rodrigo off without asking permission. Helena gasped, surprised, when she felt his hands firmly grasp her waist. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger and something deeper. Dante smiled, his fingers pressing lightly on the thin fabric of her dress. The curve of her waist fit perfectly in his hands, as if it belonged there, taking back what has always been mine. She let out a short, mocking laugh, but her body was already betraying her words. The muscles of Dante's abdomen brushed subtly against hers, his woody scent seeping into her breath. "Presumptuous as always," she murmured, feeling his fingers slide softly along her back. Dante spun her with mastery, his warm hand gliding from the base of her spine to the curve of her hip. Helena's skin tingled under his touch. "And you pretend." "Very well, but you can't lie to me, Helena." His voice dropped an octave, low, charged with raw intensity. He felt it. She felt it too. She pulled away slightly, her lips parted, her cheeks flushed. But Dante didn't let her go. "Let me go," she demanded, but her voice came out weak. He leaned his mouth close to her ear, his warm breath making her catch her breath. "You can say you feel nothing, but your body just told me a different story." She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the involuntary response of her own body. Dante smiled, satisfied. The game had begun. And he didn't intend to lose. Helena left the dance floor feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. Dante's touch still burned on her skin, even with the thin fabric of her dress separating them. She needed to compose herself. She needed to forget the heat of his hands, the way her body responded without permission. But Dante wouldn't let her escape so easily. Running away. His voice cut through the silence, heavy with something dense, provocative. She closed her eyes for a second before turning around. He was there, so close. The woody scent of his cologne, the dark eyes sparkling under the lights of the hall, the top buttons of his shirt undone, revealing a fraction of his tanned skin. He looked ready to devour her. Helena raised her chin, refusing to retreat. "If running means fleeing from a mistake, maybe. But I don't run." Dante smiled crookedly. He loved it when she challenged him. He always had, then prove it. "Accept a drink with me," Helena hesitated. Rodrigo was busy chatting with other businessmen, and she knew accepting meant opening a dangerous precedent. But deep down, she wanted to play this game. One drink, nothing more. The hotel restaurant was luxurious, discreet, perfect for whispered conversations over wine glasses. Helena crossed her legs as she sat down, aware of Dante's eyes following the movement. He leaned forward, his voice low, intimate. "You dance better than I remembered." She held the wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly before bringing it to her lips. "And you still think you can break me with cheap compliments?" Dante smiled but didn't back down. "Maybe because I know you love it when I compliment you." Helena felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the way he looked at her, as if he already knew what was under the dress, as if he could taste her skin just with his eyes, kept her body on alert. She set the glass on the table and leaned slightly forward, just enough for him to catch the scent on her neck. "You lost the right to compliment me when you replaced me, Dante." His eyes shone with intense desire. "And you lost the right to pretend you feel nothing when you dance with me." Silence. The electric tension was unbearable. Dante slid his hand across the table until his fingertips brushed hers. The touch was subtle, but the impact went straight to her core. "You can hate me, Helena." "But you can't deny there's still something between us." She felt her pulse accelerate. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to laugh in his face, but all she managed was to hold her breath because he was right. Dante smiled slowly, satisfied with her silence. The game had just begun. Helena left the restaurant with firm steps, but her heart was pounding hard. Dante was testing her limits, pushing her into dangerous territory. He looked at her as if he already had her back, as if he still had power over her. But he didn't. He couldn't, or so she tried to convince herself. The night was warm, the hair heavy with a tension so thick it seemed palpable. She clutched her purse in her hands, determined to leave, but Dante appeared beside her, his steps calculated, his gaze somber. "A ride?" His voice came low, filled with something Helena didn't want to name. "No." Her reply was quick but weak. Dante chuckled knowingly, aware of the hesitation. "Are you sure? Because I think you're trembling." Helena clenched her jaw. He was right. Her body was hot, restless, overtaken by an energy only Dante could awaken. Damn him for still knowing exactly how to break her defenses. "Good night, Dante." She turned, determined to end the night there. But before she could take another step, she felt his firm touch on her wrist. Her body froze. The heat of his skin radiated through hers, like an electric current. His fingers pressed with precision, not too hard, not soft enough to let her escape. She turned slowly and Dante took a step closer, so close that she felt his warm breath against her face. "Don't run from me, Helena. You never could." Her pulse hammered. His gaze was a dangerous abyss, a trap she had fallen into before. And the worst part? Part of her wanted to fall again. She licked her lips, an involuntary gesture, and saw his eyes darken. The desire between them was a ticking time bomb about to explode. "Let me go, Dante." The command sounded weak even to her own ears, but he didn't let go. Instead, he slid his fingers slowly up her wrist, provoking goosebumps all over her skin. His touch was a sin, an addictive poison. Helena gasped, and Dante seized the moment to lean in, brushing his lips close to her ear. "Tell me you feel nothing. Say it and I'll let you go." She closed her eyes. If she said it, it would be a lie, but admitting it would be surrender. Her silence was enough for Dante. He smiled, satisfied, and then, gently, he released her hand. "Good night, Helena." She stood, there breathing deeply, trying to ignore the heat he left on her skin, trying to ignore the fact that at that moment, the game wasn't just his. She wanted to play too. Chapter 8. Limits. Tested. Helena left the restaurant with firm steps, but her heart was pounding hard. Dante was testing her limits, pushing her into dangerous territory. He looked at her as if he already had her back, as if he still had power over her. But he didn't. He couldn't. Or so she tried to convince herself. The night was warm, the air heavy with a tension so thick it seemed palpable. She clutched her purse in her hands, determined to leave, but Dante appeared beside her, his steps calculated, his gaze somber. A ride? His voice came low, filled with something Helena didn't want to name. No. Her reply was quick but weak. Dante chuckled knowingly, aware of the hesitation. Are you sure? Because I think you're trembling. Helena clenched her jaw. He was right. Her body was hot, restless, overtaken by an energy only Dante could awaken. Damn him for still knowing exactly how to break her defenses. Good night, Dante. She turned, determined to end the night there. But before she could take another step, she felt his firm touch on her wrist. Her body froze. The heat of his skin radiated through hers, like an electric current. His fingers pressed with precision, not too hard, not soft enough to let her escape. She turned slowly and Dante took a step closer, so close that she felt his warm breath against her face. Don't run from me, Helena. You never could. Her pulse hammered. His gaze was a dangerous abyss, a trap she had fallen into before. And the worst part? Part of her wanted to fall again. She licked her lips, an involuntary gesture, and saw his eyes darken. The desire between them was a ticking time bomb about to explode. Let me go, Dante. The command sounded weak even to her own ears, but he didn't let go. Instead, he slid his fingers slowly up her wrist, provoking goosebumps all over her skin. His touch was a sin, an addictive poison. Helena gasped, and Dante seized the moment to lean in, brushing his lips close to her ear. Tell me you feel nothing. Say it, and I'll let you go. She closed her eyes. If she said it, it would be a lie. But admitting it would be surrender. Her silence was enough for Dante, and then gently he released her hand. Good night, Helena. She stood there, breathing deeply, trying to ignore the heat he left on her skin. Trying to ignore the fact that, at that moment, the game wasn't just his. She wanted to play too. Helena closed the door to her hotel room with a heavy sigh. Her body still burned. Dante's touch, the closeness, the way he had slid his fingers over her skin. It all still pulsed within her. She walked to the mirror, looking into her own eyes. What was she doing? He was a mistake, a past that should already be buried. But somehow, every time Dante got close, something inside her crumbled. Her phone buzzed. On the table. Her heart raced before she even looked at the screen. It was him. Dante, come down for a drink. Helena closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the device. She should ignore it. She should delete the message and go to bed. But instead she grabbed a light coat and headed to the hotel bar. Dante was waiting, casually leaning against the counter, a glass of whiskey in hand. His gaze swept over her body as she approached, slowly, provocatively, like an animal about to attack. I knew you'd come. Helena raised an eyebrow, trying not to show the effect he still had on her. Arrogant as always. He smirked but didn't say anything. He just raised a finger, calling the waiter. The usual for her. Helena frowned. You have no idea what I drink now. Dante swirled the whiskey in his glass and leaned closer. The woody scent of him invaded her senses, warm and addictive. No? Let's see. The waiter brought a red wine, exactly the vintage she used to drink years ago. Helena took the glass but didn't drink. She just held it, studying Dante. You didn't forget, did you? He stared at her, and for a moment there was no arrogance in his eyes, only raw desire and a hint of something deeper. Nothing about you was forgettable. The ice in her stomach melted. Helena looked away, but Dante didn't let the tension break. He touched her hand lightly, sliding his fingers over the soft skin of her wrist. The touch was gentle but precise. Calculated so she would feel it. She felt it. Oh God, how she felt it. If you say you feel nothing, I'll get up and leave right now. His voice was a whisper loaded with challenge. The kind of challenge Helena never resisted. She licked her lips, hesitating for a second, but she wouldn't lie to him. And when she lifted her eyes and saw the desire burning in his, she knew she was lost. The silence between them was dense, laden with unspoken promises. Helena held the wineglass tightly, as if that could stop her from succumbing to the chaos within her. But Dante was there, imposing, provocative, his eyes locked on her like a dangerous invitation. She wanted to leave. She wanted to. But her legs wouldn't move. Her body remembered his mouth, the hands that explored her skin, the heat only Dante could awaken. He noticed the hesitation and smiled crookedly, slowly, sinfully. That smile that always made her lose control. "Tell me you don't want this, Helena." His voice was deep, laden with something dark and intense. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. How could she say she didn't want it when her body trembled with anticipation? Dante stood up slowly, closing the distance between them. Helena felt his woody scent and his warm skin, even before his touch came. His fingers slid over her arm, a simple contact that ignited flames down her spine. "Tell me to stop." His mouth hovered near hers, not touching, just letting Helena feel his warm breath. She swallowed hard, her eyelids heavy with desire. Every cell in her body begged for it. Dante held her waist firmly, pulling her slowly. Their bodies collided, fitting together as if they always belonged to each other. Helena caught her breath. He slid his hand up her spine, reaching her nape, burying his fingers in her loose hair. The touch was both possessive and reverent. She gasped. The tension was unbearable. Then finally, Dante pressed his lips against hers. The world disappeared. The kiss was an electric shock, a raw explosion of contained desire. His tongue invaded her mouth with precision, exploring, dominating. Helena surrendered, moaning against his lips. Dante pulled her closer, and she felt the solid heat of his body, the strength of his hands sliding over her curves. His fingers slid down her thigh slowly, tracing the path of the dress slit. Helena trembled, her body already yearning for what would come next. Dante interrupted the kiss just enough to brush his lips over her neck, sucking the sensitive skin, leaving his mark. She shivered. "You're still mine, Helena. Always were." She gasped, digging her nails into his shoulders. Her body said yes, but her mind screamed no. It was at that moment reality hit her. Helena opened her eyes, feeling the weight of the past. If she gave in now, she would be returning to the same cycle. With tremendous effort, she pushed Dante back. He stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes dark with desire and surprise. "This can't happen." Her voice was hoarse, broken. She grabbed her purse and walked away, leaving Dante there in the middle of the bar, still tasting her on his lips. But he knew this wasn't over. Helena entered the hotel room and closed the door behind her with a shaky sigh. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her lips still tingling from Dante's kiss. Her body craved more. But her mind was a battlefield. She leaned against the door, her eyes closed, trying to steady her breathing. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to convince herself he was just a past mistake. But his touch still burned on her skin, as if it had marked her soul. And then 3 knocks on the door, her heart leapt. She didn't need to open it to know who it was. Helena. His voice came deep, low, a dangerous invitation. She squeezed her, eyes shut, her hands trembling on the doorknob. If she let him in, she knew there would be no going back. The silence stretched. Then he spoke again. "If you open this door, I'm not leaving." The air caught in her lungs. Every nerve in her body screamed for him. She turned the doorknob. The door opened and Dante was there. Tall, intense, domineering. His dark eyes locked onto hers, filled with hunger and something deeper. Something that made her want to run and at the same time lose herself in him. Without a word, he entered. The space between them evaporated as Dante pulled her close, his firm hand sliding over the curve of her waist. Helena gasped as she felt the solid warmth of his body against hers, the firmness of every muscle pressed against her skin. "Tell me you don't want me." His voice was a low growl, his lips brushing her ear. She closed her eyes. She couldn't. She wouldn't be able to. Dante held her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His calloused fingers slid softly over the contour of her jaw, down to her neck, pressing lightly, feeling her racing pulse beneath her skin. Helena moaned softly, and Dante smiled, a smile of pure satisfaction. "I knew." Then he kissed her. There was no more hesitation. The kiss was fierce, possessive, charged with raw desire. His hands explored her body without haste, mapping every curve, every sensitive spot that made Helena gasp against his mouth. His fingers slid down slowly, finding the slit of her dress, climbing up her exposed thigh, teasing her with light touches that made her writhe. He knew her body. He knew exactly how to bring her to the edge. Helena pulled at his shirt, her fingers traveling over the hot, firm skin of his abdomen. Dante grabbed her hip, pressing her against him, making it clear how much he wanted her, how much he needed her. "Tell me you don't want me, Helena." His mouth traced a fiery path along her neck. Down her exposed collarbone, she grabbed his hair, tilting her head back, her lips parted in pure surrender. She said nothing, because there were no more lies between them. Helena's breathing was still accelerated as she slid her fingers through the nape of Dante's neck, feeling his damp hair under her touch. He was there, close, warm, as real as the need that pulsed between them. She should never have opened that door. But now it was too late. Dante held her face with firm hands, his dark eyes locked onto hers. There was no more arrogance, no more games. There was truth. "This was never just desire for me, never." His voice was low, rough, but sincere. Helena swallowed hard. She wanted to believe, she wanted to trust, but the past still weighed on her chest. Dante noticed. He always noticed. He brushed his thumb lightly over her lower lip, trailing the touch down her neck, resting his hand over her racing heart. "You can try to run, but your body doesn't know how to lie to me." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words, feeling his presence in every fiber of her being. Dante pulled her close, their bodies colliding in a perfect fit. The heat between them was suffocating, dense. Their lips brushed, but he didn't kiss her immediately. He waited, and when Helena finally lifted her face and took the initiative, she felt everything explode. The kiss was deep, intense, charged, with everything that had been repressed for too long. His hands slid over her waist, tracing every curve, as if he wanted to rediscover the body that had always been his. His fingers pressed firmly against her warm skin, pulling her closer as, if he needed to feel every inch of her, Helena lost herself. In his mouth, in his touch, in his desire. Dante held her by the nape of her neck, tilting her to explore her exposed skin. His warm breath against her collarbone lit up her entire body. He murmured against her skin, his words carrying a truth Helena couldn't ignore. The world around them vanished. It was just them, and for the first time in years, Helena realized she was exactly where she wanted to be. In the arms of the only man who had ever made her feel alive. Sometimes life gives us a second chance, but we aren't always brave enough to take it. Dante and Helena had to lose each other to understand the true value of what they had. Love can survive time, pain, and even betrayal, but only if both are willing to fight for it. And you? Do you believe a past love can be reborn stronger? If you were in Helena's place, would you give him another chance or move on? Tell me in the comments. Enjoy this emotion and dive into another captivating story. Click on the screen and let yourself be carried away by another intense and unforgettable romance.